Hello everybody, this is Miss Wills and I'm just going to be going through the next few lessons on Act 2 of an Inspector Calls with you. As always, I just would like to remind you that each lesson does have a lesson objective, so if you just make sure by the end of it you're comfortable you've met them, and obviously if not, just ask your teacher for a bit of help. The green text boxes are tasks you must complete and the red are challenge tasks as well. And of course, on some of the slides, we will provide answers for you to check your own answers with. So to make a start, this is lesson 20 and we're going to be focusing on the contrasting characters in Inspector Calls so far. And your lesson objectives today are to explore how language and dialogue is used by Priestley to create contrast and to begin to discuss the contrast between the characters and why Priestley has done this. So in your booklet, it'll be page 28 that you want to look at for today's lesson. So we'll start with a little recap. If you could please for me just summarise Act 1 in 4 bullet points, 4 sentences there, just to remind yourself about the key events that have happened so far. So if you could just pause this clip and get those down, those ideas down, please. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to what we're doing today's lesson. We'll start with curating a new term, and the term is contrast. Now this is a technique, a device used by writers to emphasize difference, as it says on the screen. And with an Inspector Calls, we're going to be focusing specifically on contrast between characters, especially today, and what it tells us about particular traits in characters, the relationships between characters, and how this contrast is used to kind of convey political messages and a deeper meaning. So that's the kind of thing we're going to be looking at today. So if you make sure, please, that you get the definition for contrast down, I just pause this clip while you do that. Okay, moving on. In your booklet, you should have this question. It says, how does Priestley contrast Sheila and Mr. Boleyn in their willingness to admit to their own faults through their dialogue? So the two characters we're going to be focusing on here is Mr. Boleyn and Sheila. You will see at the bottom here, we have on the left-hand side some quotes from Mr. Boleyn, and on the right-hand side, we have some quotes from Sheila. Now then, what this question is asking you to do, encouraging you to do, is to not only discuss about a technique used by Priestley, which is of course contrast. It is also asking you to use evidence to support it, which we have down here. And of course, when you're answering a question, you don't stop there. You've got to explore those ideas and analyze the language that is used. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing with this and the next sort of part of the lesson. So what I'd like you to do first of all is with those quotes there, I would like you to write around them, highlight them, just analyze specific word choices, language choices that Priestley's used and what it suggests about that character at this point in the play. I will give you an example. So here we have a quote from Mr. Boleyn. Still, I can't accept any responsibility. Now, what I would have focused on here is first of all the use of the word I, the personal pronoun I, which shows he again is talking about himself. He's done this a lot already at the beginning of the play, and it just shows he's very self-absorbed and he's full of self-importance as well. What I would also zoom in on is this contraction can't, which is important because he really does believe he has no part to play in the death of Eva Smith, or the fact that, you know, he really made her life quite challenging when he fired her. So he is quite ignorant, we can tell from that language there. And also we have the word still, which suggests Boleyn is kind of stuck in his old ways. He isn't going to change. He's kind of in this cycle where, you know, he's only ever thinking about himself and no one else. How is the inspector going to encourage him to kind of think about, you know, outside of his little bubble, to think about someone else at this moment in time if he's stuck in these old ways? And the word any shows he's very close-minded and willing to learn. So that's kind of what I would say about the language there, and that's kind of the level of analysis I would like you to do for the other quotes as well. I will show you one more example, and this is a quote by Sheila. I felt rotten about it at the time, and now I feel a lot worse. Obviously, we have a contrast here, and the use of the personal pronoun I, whereas with Mr. Boleyn, it was to kind of emphasize his selfishness and ignorance. Here, it kind of gives us an insight into how Sheila is feeling. At this point, she feels remorse. She feels bad for what she's done. She's recognizing the wrong that she's done. And we've got repetition of references to her feelings suggests she can't overlook what's happened. She's plagued by what she's done. And the use of negative language such as rotten, up here, and worse suggests she feels awful about how she's treated Eva. She's taken a little bit of responsibility here, which is of course in complete contrast to the last quote we've just seen of Mr. Boleyn. So what I'd like you to do now for me, please, is to pause this clip again. I would like you to do similar kind of analysis of the other quotes for me. Okay, guys, hopefully you've managed to do that, and that's going to help you with the next activity. So what I'd like you to do now is to bring your ideas together and write me a little paragraph. So we've got the question again at the top, so you can remind yourself of what it's asking. And what you've got on this slide as well is just some sentence starters to really help you out if you need them. So what this encourages you to do, and what we always need to do when we're writing a paragraph, is you need to make sure that you make a clear point. Make a clear point first. And then obviously support that with evidence before you then go on to explain and analyze. Now, as you can see, this explain portion of the paragraph is a lot larger. So most of your paragraph, the bulk of your paragraph, should be explaining and analysing the evidence that you've put down by zooming in on language choices and word choices and techniques, etc. So I would like you to give this a go. So if you can pause the clip again for me, please, and write that paragraph. Okay, moving on. I would now like you to read pages 25 to 26. So this is from when the inspector says, "That's what I asked myself tonight," to the end of Act 1 where he says, "Well." So what I would like you to do when you're reading is to look at a contrast between Sheila and Gerald. Perhaps you could have one highlighter for one character and another colour highlighter for the other, in terms of highlighting and looking at how they respond to the situation and the inspector differently, and their willingness to work with the inspector. And I would like you just to write down at least 3 pieces of evidence for both of them here. So evidence that Sheila is supportive of the inspector, and evidence that Gerald isn't helping the inspector in his inquiries as well. So you just pause this clip and do that for me. Hopefully you managed to get some ideas down there. I'll just share with you some of the things that I kind of looked at and focused on here. With Sheila, we have kind of her almost taken on the inspector's role, in a sense of sharing his role, and she becomes now to interrogate Gerald. She is wanting to get the information out of him. She says on page 25 at the bottom, "Well, Gerald," and we've got Gerald really not willing to talk. "Well, what, Sheila?" And he even lies. He's even very dishonest when, she says, "You did know this girl." He says, "I didn't." So he tries to deceive them very much in this part. And even later on, when he does admit to Sheila that, "I did know this girl," he tries to persuade Sheila. He says, we can't say anything to the inspectors. For God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector." He's really not willing to help the inspector, cooperate with him at all. But it's Sheila who says he knows. He already knows. She's basically encouraging him to share what he knows already. So we definitely have Sheila starting to help and starting to work with the inspector here, and Gerald very much avoiding it and trying to deceive everyone. So that's the kind of ideas you might have down and might have picked up on as well. Bearing that in mind, what I'd like you to do now is have a little look at this line here. So it's this kind of line of how much responsibility you think the characters are actually taking, from Mr. Billings saying he still can't accept any responsibility, to Sheila obviously now considering, oh, am I responsible now? Where would Gerald be on the scale at this moment in time, do you think? I would like you to place him on the scale, but I would also like you to write a quote down underneath that supports why you've put him on the scale, and just write down why you've placed him here. If you can just pause this clip again to do that. Okay, guys. Final thought for this lesson before we wrap it up. I just want you to now consider, why has Priestley created contrast between Mr. Boleyn, Sheila and Gerald? So we've looked at what contrasts are there. So we have specifically looked at contrasts again between Mr. Boleyn and Sheila, and now between Sheila and of course Gerald as well. What do we think the differences are? Why has he shown us this contrast? I just want you to have a little think and write your ideas down. Perhaps think about class and how different classes perhaps might approach and react to things. Think about the influence of old money that Gerald comes from there. Think about the idea of older generation versus younger generation. Might it say something about that also? So I'd just like you to write your final ideas down for me, and then that will be the end of this lesson. So thank you very much for listening, guys, and if you do have any questions, please just email your teacher.